previously filled with representing Windows and Microsoft in SIG Node. I am just getting back from parental leave. So I've been in the meetings for on and off before this, but I should be pretty active here now. Just a little bit of what SIG Windows is trying to do is in 1.18 and 1.19, we've really been pushing for getting Containerd stable and usable as a container runtime in the Windows nodes. I think we're making progress on that and promoting that to beta in 1.19. There's been surprisingly very few changes that have been needed in Kubernetes to enable that. So that's been great. Most of the changes have been the Windows operating system or Containerd itself.
Mark, do you want to briefly mention that you plan to, last time we talked about what's the next step, how better the SIG Windows and the SIG Node can collaborate, especially for a lot of node-related issues and features, PS? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Don and I had talked, and I'm going to be working on kind of a document of a roadmap to kind of highlight where SIG Windows wants to kind of invest in the compute space for Kubernetes, and share that out with the team once that's ready.
Yeah, I just want to add it. Last couple meeting we talk about, and we feel we don't really understand what the SIG Windows and also the Windows container had to. So there's some like the PR, maybe is even like the controversial, and by design, by implementation. So now with the Mark support and the help, and we plan to review once he done his document, and we can review at the SIG Node, and then we can start to identify some approver and reviewer from our side, and then there's some cross the SIG network and the SIG Node work, even maybe also have some the SIG storage, so then we can coordinate better, collaborate better, and provide our support from both SIGs. So Max, thanks for here. Yeah.
I can just kind of provide a very high level of the two things. So I think the two big kind of work items that we're trying to push forward with SIG Windows is one, just having a lot of the kind of container features, get a lot of features to parity where they are with Linux. And for Windows, without going into too much detail, Containerd is kind of the only path forward for that. There's a subsystem in Windows called the host compute system, which is responsible for most of what Run C normally takes care of in Linux. And Docker, that was built around an older version of kind of the Windows API to interact with that. That's very, very painful or very, very slow and drawn out to get any changes to that. There's an updated API, sometimes referred to as the HCS v2 in the Containerd code path, that is much easier to get changes in, and much more, I would say that API was much more designed for container orchestrators orchestrating large amounts of containers, whereas the V1 API was kind of designed around starting single containers. And so that's why we've been making such a big push to move to Containerd, is it just introduces a lot more flexibility for how Windows can start and manage containers. The other kind of area that SIG Windows is investing in is Hyper-V isolated containers. And that's essentially where containers on Windows would be started in a very lightweight VM, referred to as a utility VM or UVM. And that allows Windows to provide a lot better isolation between containers, and also a lot more granular resource controls for the container workloads. So we're hoping to move forward with enabling those on Windows nodes as well.
Hi, Mark. Martin here. Just one thing, we've put some tests into Creo tools, and testing against Containerd, Creo, etc. And one of them is we've changed a lot of our testing and building into GitHub workflows. And a part of that is using Windows and some of the stuff we've done in there. So it might be of interest at some stage to, if you want to sync up with us on that, to see what we've done there, because a lot of the work we've been doing is probably just finding it out in the dark, finding out where the issues are and trying to get it to work. So maybe your input on that would be quite handy on from the Windows OS.
Sure, sure. I'll probably reach out on Slack sometime later today, and we can figure out what the best path forward is to stay in sync.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you, Mac. And let's move to next topic. Derek, I just make you the co-host. Do you want to share your doc, present your doc, the feature health? Yeah.
Let me. Getting a weird rendering right now. Are folks able to see the doc?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, as a part of the spirit of like seeing things through to completion, I think folks are aware that we're trying to roll out some new policies in SIG architecture around avoiding permanent beta for RESTful APIs. So that would cover things like runtime class or pod disruption budget and that type of thing. And so there's already project momentum around trying to get RESTful resources out of that beta status and either remove them or via deprecation, or motivate the community to try to see them go forward to general availability. In that spirit, I kind of wanted to take an audit of like, not necessarily the REST APIs, because Kubelet itself doesn't necessarily directly serve those in this call, but look at the Kube features that we had in flight in the SIG and kind of take a step back and ask like, is there something we can be doing as a community here to either help get new volunteers to help grow the work, to see it to completion where the original advocates might have moved on to new activities? Or is this a good time for us to step back and ask if the feature stalled, is it worth continuing to do? The doc is a little out of date even when I did it, because when I first counted it was about 24. I think it's probably about 30 if I recount the rows. And it doesn't cover some other things that are not captured in the kubefeatures.go file where we have all of our feature gates. So this definitely does not cover the state of something like CRI going from an alpha status to some newer status. Nor does an earlier iteration of it cover, say, the work around cgroups v2, where that's just basically detecting the state of the host, but not requiring a user to enable a feature flag. But either way, this felt like a good place to start. And so I sent this table out to the SIG Node Google group. So anybody who is a member of that group should have edit rights on this doc. And what I thought I would do is quickly go through some of the features. And most of the comments here, I think, came from my own initial assumption on what we could or couldn't do around this feature. And then obviously feedback and volunteers are really desired. So some of them are kind of embarrassing when you look at, like, we have a beta feature on AppArmor since 1.4. So I don't know if Sasha's on here, but I guess what I'm looking to see for AppArmor in particular, like, what could we do in 120 to kind of move this forward? And in that vein, for each of these feature rows, if someone wanted to volunteer to help move something forward, some of these features predated KEPs, so there wasn't like a clean document to go and update and edit, where to actually move it forward, we might want to restate what the state of the feature is in a proper KEP, and then what gaps remain to actually move it to GA. I'm not aware of actually a designer on AppArmor. So hopefully, Sasha, if you're there, you want to help enrich that, that'd be great. Dynamic kubelet config. I know this was a long-standing effort in SIG Node for a while. I'm not aware of any actual adopters in the wild. And I don't think we have the actual traction in the SIG to see it forward. And I think maybe in retrospect, the adoption might be a sign of it not meeting like providers and users appropriately. So my rough assumption here, and we touched this on a little bit in SIG architecture a few weeks back when debating some topics in SIG auth, was to remove the feature. And so removing it because it is beta would require deprecation, but like if there wasn't a disagreement around that, I'd like to deprecate it in 120, but again, feedback welcome. Moving down the list, we had some alpha features that are very much just sitting there. One that came from a colleague of mine at Red Hat around host user namespace defaulting. Personally, I'd love to eliminate this feature and just move forward on a more a better enriched user namespace design, given the current state of pods differs from 1.5. And so I'm not aware of anybody using this, but in general, it seemed like that was a good thing to do from a cleanup standpoint. Device plugins, I don't know if Renaud is here or Manal, but this is one of those areas where it was like, I'm very much aware of almost everyone using these things in practice, but we kind of haven't yet moved forward on the plan in the last 10 releases to see the next step to GA. I didn't know, Manal, if you're there, or Renaud, if you want to talk about the current state of the container device orchestration work and how that might work.
Yeah, so Renaud is not on the call. So far the focus has been on the lower level plumbing. So this CD, I think of it as a JSON spec that describes modification to your runtime spec, the intention is to make it work across container runtimes as long as you're using OCI underneath. So we have a meeting Tuesday of next week. I think that's where we can bring up the discussion around device plugins, because we have never discussed that in the past few meetings. And then I guess come back to SIG Node. Okay.
And then for the...
I would add to it. So beside the low level things, what we're discussing in CDI working group, there are several things which potentially might be changing with device plugin interface, because like if CDI will be implemented, when few parameters will be changed, how it's passed down. And beside that, it was in the community several issues related to device plugins to extend the APIs, like deallocate was one of those, and few others. So practically, like the vendor who are using the device plugins, we want to extend it, but there is no agreement how to extend it.
Yes, that's my understanding. Actually, there's the intents at the node level, but at the device plugin API level, they also have like the long-term issue we didn't address. And they want to add more expanded. And at the same time, we also feel like the certain API, maybe it is polluted API and cause some problem for the support. So we need to finish those problems. Since we already interrupted this flow, so I also want to add for AppArmor. For AppArmor, actually, we could narrow down the scope. The originally one for the GA, we actually have like the node level of the daemon set. We already have the daemon set, but there are some more things to improve. But we could, since AppArmor is already adopted by the production and for such long, and people start using, so we could narrow down from the original GA scope and promote that to GA. And the dynamic Kubernetes config, it is, we definitely initially for that one, actually we want to have like the controller implementation, but since we don't have the controller implemented, and there's never settled down to on how to implement class level of the controller for that dynamic Kubernetes config. And also there's I believe all the vendor Evolve have their own implementation to management of those configurations. And so I personally totally okay to remove that feature. But we need, because we are lack of adoption for that one, just like the Derek mentioned, like we didn't heard anyone using so far. And so we basically maybe need to figure out to just make that more announcement publicly, and then give a time, just remove it to simplify our code base. That's pretty complicated feature. And also doing that dynamic Kubernetes config, I want to say that actually we switch off the Kubernetes flag and to the Kubernetes config, the component config, and that's the first of the component config actually being graduated. So
yeah,
there's the
I think
progress.
Yes. The component config change was a big change, and it's definitely not something that we want to get rid of. It's a good thing. So hopefully my comment wasn't misconstrued in that regard. I love the kubelet config file. So yeah, so I guess we could have a dialogue in each one if we wanted for these. Some of them I feel like are less controversial. Some of them, it's like SIG Node and a little bit with maybe a mirror in SIG. I don't know if I want to go through every one right now, but I think the general thing I was looking to do was maybe spur some focused contribution from new members who might want to figure out a way to engage, or just have the dialogue here to say things that we started we want to maybe give up. So maybe if I focus on those, the clause reserved one, this was a feature we had that tried to induce memory pressure in lower clause tiers, so pods and higher clause tiers couldn't have memory taken from them. Kind of talking with Renal on this and a little bit with Giuseppe, I think the path that this was looking at, maybe we could do something better with secrets v2. So in general, wanted to look to remove that. I think Seth did that originally. I don't know, Seth, if you're too upset about that. CPU manager, maybe pause on this one for a little bit. Like some of these features like CPU manager and topology manager, I think maybe the path to general availability of these things, we held ourselves to maybe a higher bar than needed. And then in some cases, like Dawn, you said around AppArmor, it might be good for us to, my daughter's crying. It might be good to maybe reset our expectations. So for example, if topology manager didn't align huge pages yet, that doesn't prevent us necessarily from moving the feature to GA. It would just mean when we increment the feature to have a new capability, it would just be a new feature gate, right? So yeah, for some of those things, I was thinking we might want to take that posture to say, hey, there's really no reason why topology manager in its present capability couldn't move to GA. And as we increment it, just do it under a new feature gate, because having something perpetually in beta kind of also gives a bad signal versus incremental capability going into alpha and then beta. Yeah. So the one I want to call out here, and I don't know, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Zalando. We had this flag to do dynamic quota period. And I felt like the history of this was prior to the kernel bug around CFS quota not being widely understood. Given the work that was going forward with Secrets v2 enablement and stuff, I kind of wanted to see if we could think through ways of reducing these. I don't know if anyone on the call might be aware, but my perspective is that the kernel bug around CFS quota enforcement may have skewed our thought processes towards this feature. And so I'm curious if the thing is still in alpha, which means we could drop it. Do people have any good reason to think on a going forward basis we need to continue allow period to be dynamically updated? Or maybe
I think there's the people, even in alpha, there's some people already started using this feature. And even our production, they have the user ask us, can we enable that? I mean, I'm talking about Google GKE. Yeah. We didn't enable this feature. I just want to say we didn't enable this feature because this is so hard to use, but I do know there's even it's alpha. This feature in some situation it is using. So it's alpha. We can deprecate, but at the same time, not everyone upgrade to the new kernel, and also I heard the new kernel also have some other problem around that. So we may just make clear to swing, and we may don't have the real plan to promote that to beta and GA, and because we are waiting for SIG version 2 out, and there's the maybe better answer on this one, and we need to qualify and testing that one. I guess maybe that's another one. Is kind of special, exceptional case we want here.
Yeah, so I'm very accommodating, right? If people are using it, we don't want to break them, right? So I don't know if it's just my Zoom or internet that's lagging, but I don't want to get the wrong perception. So if people were using this or they had data that showed it was still needed, I wasn't sure, but right now it lacked an owner really moving it forward.
Yeah, one thing to add. Yeah, sorry, one thing to add about that specifically. I mean, I think you're right. It is mostly attributed to that kernel bug that tells you where it was necessary to override that. But I think I've still heard of some people using that, especially when you set limits. People hit some throttling issues, and I've seen some people who lower the period from, I think the default's like 100 to something lower to work around some of those issues. But I can look closer, but I believe it's still being used, at least in some rare cases.
Okay, even after they had an updated kernel. That's to me like I haven't seen data that showed it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and even this feature, like there was probably other ways we could have approached it, like rather than the kubelet could have picked up maybe a default period setting on the node, and then the node could have had a system-wide setting. But either way, this is good feedback, and so maybe we can get some of that collected on the doc. That would be good, and I might reach out to, I think it was Zalando who originally wanted this. Some of the other ones, sys controls, I'm not aware of any actual issues with this in production. I think we had a general desire of identifying better safe versus unsafe sys controls, but I don't really think that's necessary for us to complete before moving this to GA, given how widely used this is, and the boundary between safe and unsafe seems to blur. But this seems like a feature that's heavily used in my experience that I haven't heard a ton to hold it back. And maybe we could use some help who want to help move this forward, I guess. For the PID limiting or any of the PID limiting ones that I had here, this was another example of like something that went beta had to sat there for a year. I opened a PR to just promote that to GA because I didn't see any negatives. So that's just good cleanup. Trying to think going through here. One thing that intrigued me was around the proc mount type. This was a feature that came in 1.12, but hasn't really had any use cases identified yet, to my knowledge, that made it get high enough to want to go to a beta status. And so like when I see a feature that might be sitting there in alpha for 2 years, I kind of wonder, like, did it lack a clear use case? Giuseppe alluded to maybe a potential use case, but I wasn't sure if others in the community had that identified.
I think like for that one, right, when we do with the user namespace build stuff, we may immediately know whether this is useful for that or not. And maybe we may tie it to another user namespace flag if needed. So I guess we just wait for some more information.
Okay. And then trying to think of other highlights here. The huge pages work got moved to beta in 1.18 for empty dir usage. I know at least at Red Hat we're using this, and it's used in a lot of performance sensitive environments. So like I actually am not aware of a reason why we wouldn't move that to GA. But if others, I don't know if Intel or others in the community had been looking at it who worked in this space, had any blockers, like be great to raise them. Maybe runtime class I thought was on the agenda afterwards, and we can talk a little bit on that separately. But in general,
Derek, for this one, the set hostname as of KDN, like I can take ownership, like as I pushing that feature through. Okay. So usage, is that like a requirement for promoting this? We were hoping to change this to GA directly for 120, but I'm uncertain how it works and what metrics I will have to put.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of something going alpha to GA in one step. Like you have to go to this alpha, beta, GA progression. And like with beta, you might be on by default. And when I talk about usage, I don't really mean, it's more just like we as like a community of engineers who may have tried it out and found rough edges. It's not necessarily, and so any individual usage or any usage you might see on behalf of like users you're representing is all we're looking for, like pain points and that type of thing. For that one though, I think that'd be great. Like, so maybe to conclude here a little bit, like if anyone wants to help shepherd a feature forward that might not yet be in that state, if you could like make yourself known, that would be good. And then maybe in next week's meeting, we can kind of coalesce on like, what do we want to target in 120? Like, I think it's good if we can go in 121 and see like our feature debt load, not just increasing, but getting to completion. And maybe we can find a balance between things we want to move forward that we had started versus new things we want to add in 120 or 121. So if folks want to identify new features here that they want to talk through, feel free to add them. But I just thought it was useful and healthy to take a summary on where we stood. And with that, I will stop sharing.
I just want to add one thing about goes through that alpha, beta to GA. So a lot of people, unless they are really in production pain, so that they don't try the alpha feature, they will try the beta feature. So it is still case by case, and because we try to avoid the situation, and right after we promote to beta and the API require change and design require change, or we maybe our implementation not support general use cases and instead support one special use cases, so then we have to redo whole thing. So this is why, and normally we go through like the alpha, beta, and GA. Just share it here, but it still is case by case. A certain feature maybe not initially have a huge intention and huge tense and a lot of arguments, but at the end the implementation is really straightforward, and there's not much of the chaos, and we maybe could be direct goes to the GA, just like the Derek say.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. Yeah, I'll try to follow up with some of you maybe to see how I proceed and what I need to do. I'm still looking into it. Thank you.
Okay, cool. A lot of times it's just going back and seeing if we had sufficient testing. Some of these things before the KEP process before SIG release had pushed you to show tests before the feature would go to beta. It's very likely we might have a testing gap on some of these things. And so just getting that audited would be a really good step. But if you had sufficient tests and that type of thing, yeah.
Yeah, I think the most controversial thing about this feature specifically was the decision we made about longer names, like how we proceed with the longer FQDN names. And if this decision was okay and it's working for everybody, I think it's also gives one more signal. So I think it was the most controversial part of it.
Yeah. Cool.
Yes. Deb, do you want to move to the next topic? Do you want to talk about the pit to limit? GA, I think that already been proved and reviewed, and I agree.
Yeah. I was just trying to put it as like, hey, here's an example of a really small PR that we can go and make a change for the better. So it's possible on one of these lists when people review it, they'll see it was already tested. There's not a lot of controversy, and we could just move forward. So I was more just trying to role model with that one. So
cool. Sergey, do you want to talk about the runtime class GA plan?
Yeah, I want to follow up on runtime class and comment from Derek that we need more feedback. We widely use it in Google, so it's I think it's proven for us that it's working. So we would like to get them GA, and I wonder if we have other use and anybody in community can speak up and tell if there are some problems. And if there is a process that I need to follow a cap that people can give feedback for, or like any other process that I need to follow, I will be happy to push through and make it to GA.
Hi, this is Mark again. I know from the Windows side, when we get to the point where we're we're adding more testing around the Hyper-V isolated containers. There were some keps that were authored probably 2 or 3 releases ago with some plans to add or potentially add some more flags to runtime classes for Windows support. And I think we're planning on using runtime classes pretty heavily. But I think as previously discussed, if we just need to add new kind of API fields behind feature gates, that shouldn't stop anything from going to GA.
Yeah. Actually, the Windows support is one of the use cases initially when we discussed for runtime class. There are other things also. And I was just wondering, do we want to make that is the blocker GA or just basically narrow down the scope and just move forward? And then I'd make that it is runtime class extended feature in the future and add new future gate. Maybe that's sounds like that's maybe is okay approach for a lot of the people. Anyway, it's open to discussing here. Yeah.
So for runtime class, what I was trying to allude to my comment there, and I'm still not clear on. I have to go and audit what we had. Runtime class is one of those APIs that is now on the timer, right, to get out of perma beta status. So it's a good one to focus on. I think the issue that I think I'd want to just be cautious on is like, what does it mean to test that in conformance? Because it's very coupled to configuration of a container runtime itself. So as long as we can make, maybe we could just do a review on what our approach will be to do conformance testing around it. That would be good, because it's basically that thing that lets you be creative. And I don't want to be too draconian on how we treat conformance of it. I don't know, Mrinal, if you want to talk about what we're doing at Red Hat a little bit around runtime class, but I guess we are starting to use it more ourselves. And I don't know if other vendors or users on the call want to share their experience.
So we have 2 different use cases. One is for enabling kata. We also have an operator to do that whole installation, to install kata runtime class for CRI-O, reconfigure it, and then you can use the operator to remove it as well. So I'll put a link to that repo in the SIG Node document. And the second use case where we are thinking of using it is for enabling user namespaces. So CRI-O, we are in the process of merging user namespace support. And what we intend to do is we use it just for doing our builds without privileges. And then we want to gate this using runtime classes instead of just enabling it by default. So we can use our SCC, which is like pod security policy, to control which pods can use this capability in CRI-O.
Yeah, so at least for those two use cases, Sergey, there wasn't anything that, it's a useful tool to have in the community to meet these needs that, like, from our side on Red Hat, I didn't feel any major objection to, other than just wanting to revisit how the conformance test would work, because you basically need a no-op test. Can I CRUD runtime classes, and does the pod have the runtime class? But you can't have anything that, like, tests the behavior of the pod afterwards in a conformance test, in my opinion. And I think if it goes to GA, it should probably loosely be covered under conformance. And so that would be my only major concern.
Thank you.
I also want to raise another one, and maybe it's not the really blocker for this GA, but definitely have the quite tight dependency. It is on the pod overhead. And so are we going to, so original, we decouple those two feature, and but do we want to together to promote of the pod overhead to GA, or we want to further decouple? And so are we going to hopefully the pod overhead being GA first, and then have the runtime class? Because there has a lot of the dependency. Initially, actually, it's the same project, and then we just cautiously make that decouple, those two decouple. So I just risk here, and we need to consider and make decision.
Yeah. So for myself, I would be fine runtime class going to GA before pod overhead, especially if we found ourselves running up to the wire on the deprecation time windows that SIG-Arch was pushing through. Just because there's a lot of use cases that runtime classes meet independent of pod overhead, right? And so at least for us, Mernal shared too. And I guess in the Kata one, we could benefit from pod overhead. But for being able to expose particular runtime behaviors that didn't come with overhead, like the use case stuff I was talking about, it's not a major blocker for me.
Okay, that's good, because I saw the Kata maybe have more dependency on the pod overhead. So for us, because gvisor don't have that huge dependency, this is why pod overhead project since day one, because when we have the info container, we've been talking about this one, but we didn't really fund it. To really fund that project, it is mostly just because of solve that Kata related overhead. If the Red Hat is the heavy using of the Kata, and that's not a blocker, I think maybe we can remove one of those dependency there. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, cool. Do we want to make a push for that in 120?
Sergey, do you want to?
Pod overhead? I can take it.
We were talking about runtime class. Yeah, runtime class.
Yeah, so runtime class, yes. And wasn't Mernal working? Mernal, you promised a link. Can you put it into meeting notes? A link
yeah,
on,
sure.
yes,
Yeah,
okay,
I'll
thank
add
you.
the links. Yeah.
Okay, I have three action items for runtime class, and I will try to complete them by next week. At least I have a plan.
Thanks, Sergey, for the volunteer to take this job. Next one, I think still is your topic. You just remind everyone you want to call on.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind, if you wasn't on Kubernetes Dev and didn't receive this notification, we will have a push for 120 code flow, and there is a specific ordering that release team is recommending, and I just want to make sure that like Derek and Dawn, I think you are only two here who has a permission to assign milestones for SIG Node, at least. So yeah, you'll need to allocate some time next week and be very track it very closely, like which PRs go in and which we postpone. And I think originally I thought that we need to clean up current milestones, but it seems that the release team will do that early next week. Once they will cut 119, they will remove all the milestones from all the PRs, so we can start from scratch.
Thanks.
Just a quick question. It's my fault for not being there. I was just quickly curious why the push for GA. Is beta, if you want to use it, beta's not good enough at this point, or?
Yeah, so this policy came out of SIG architecture, so it's not rooted in SIG Node, just for awareness. And what we were basically observing was features would go to a beta status, and then many of the engineers would just move on. And so there's a strong desire to either see it through, and especially for things that are beta but not on by default. Like there's a lot of those. And then there's some APIs that are just kind of in beta that are kind of stuck. Like pod security policy is one I'll pick on there. And so anyway, the SIG architecture API kept, I can link to in the notes if you hadn't seen it, but there was a policy change in 119 that basically said if an API was in beta for more than 3 releases, then it either immediately gets deprecated and then is deprecated for something like 6 releases afterwards, like users don't just break. Or you move it to GA, or you move it to a new version of beta, like beta v2, beta v3. And so the idea was just to make sure that like folks stay engaged on their work and see it through completion, essentially.
Okay, cool, awesome. Thanks, Derek. I appreciate it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, were there other topics you wanted to cover, Don? Is there an update on how the testing meetings were going? I know I didn't get to go this week, but I thought there was a meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we have any meetings, and right now one question we're trying to resolve is how to identify tests on SIG Node which are critical enough and like provide a bird's eye, like single pane of glass view of like whether the SIG Node is healthy or not healthy. Right now there are many dashboards with many tests, and some of them like Christmas tree, like red and green. So we want to make sure that there is a tab that like contains all the tests that we mostly care about. Eventually we want all the tests to be in this category, that we really care about all the tests, but from a current status, it will be a gradual process. So we identify that, and yeah, we looking into specific areas like containerd and what else? Yeah, I think containerd is the biggest one that is very questionable, like what coverage do we have for that, and how to fix all the tests. So this is another area. Yeah, it's going good. People on this call, if you're interested in helping with this CI and end-to-end testing, please join a meeting on Monday. It's a good beginning of the week for everybody. Very refreshing.
Is there a way to get the calendar invite for the meeting? Is it pasted somewhere?
Yeah. There is separate Google group. I can put it into a meeting note right now.
Thanks.
I just send the share through chat, room chat. There's the old doc, and Yuji wrote for the SIG Node, and he and I spent some time to look into that one and the categories, how we want to recategorize of the SIG Node test. And some is already done, and some it is not finished. And also that can share for the new node test group, and can share some like background context. I just put here. I will put that link also to our meeting notes.
Yeah, I think Morgan brought it up already, and we scheduled to review it next week.
So just on the follow-ups from last time, I was looking through the agendas. I did tag the sidecar container KEP update, which basically captured the learnings on the gaps from the initial KEP. And so I did merge that. I want to thank the authors for doing that. We still are not yet clear on a path forward for this, even with that KEP merge. It could be a factor of like the users who I'd been talking with that might have been skewing my thinking when reading the KEP. But one thing I'm curious on, I don't know if we have the right contact, is a lot of the original motivation and still motivation for the KEP was around service mesh use cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like, given the prominence of that, I wanted to really understand if the kubelet was to take on this capability, would a service mesh actually recommend that this be the default usage pattern? And I'm openly skeptical on that, and I'm curious if others are maybe engaged with those communities to kind of like inform my skepticism. But the KEP alluded to two paths. One is the CNI approach, and the other one is a sidecar approach. I know at Red Hat we use the CNI approach. I'm not on the service mesh team here at Red Hat, so I can't really speak too deeply, and I'll follow up with them. But a lot of the users I talk to don't really, would seem to object to dynamic sidecar injections generally. Like the same users who say, I don't want to let you exec into a pod would be the same users that say, I don't want to let you inject random sidecars into my containers. That like, I'm wondering if there's any way we can get a concrete recommendation that says, if Kube was to take on this use case, we would actually only recommend sidecar injection, or we would only recommend CNI. What's going to happen is, if we took on the use case, we'd still defer the problem to the user, and you'd have two ways of doing the same thing, which is almost like having two ways of deploying devices or two ways of doing monitoring. But like here in SIG Node, we'd feel both sides of the pain. And so maybe as a closing appeal, if someone could maybe help me, if I'm not just alone doing this, figuring out like, if we took on this capability, would it actually be the only way that things are used? I'm just very skeptical on that. And given its prominence in the KEP, I feel like I want a more definitive statement on, yes, this is what we would always do. And I feel like that might not be the case. Does anyone know?
Yeah, me and Don had a meeting with Istio team in Google, and I'm curious, like before I comment on that, I'm curious, is Red Hat using CNI approach, and like when CNI completely replaces all the calls, like is there no injection at all? Because in Google, there is a CNI approach when CNI plugin helps to change IP tables, so we don't need to have init container. But the same way, we need to have some executable, some proxy that needs to be deployed anyway, and we inject this proxy into pod. So we still need both CNI and injected part. Are you completely getting rid of this injected part? Is it just deployed on a box somehow? Like, do you know?
I need to follow up myself, honestly, but we do deploy the CNI approach by default. And like, at least at Red Hat, we always run multis, so we have more than one CNI. And then the privilege benefits that were enumerated were there. But that's an action item for me to follow up on, but I was just curious if anybody else, the way the KEP described it, it was an either or choice on, if I had sidecars, I would never use CNI. And if I, and either way, so that was my feeling before just merging that now, is like, if anybody had a general pulse on how things were, but that's homework I'll follow up on. But
yeah.
The other issue I felt like, and this is a recurring theme, was the use cases around sidecar containers are really about a lot of times bundling the infrastructure to support my app with the pod itself, rather than depending on the infrastructure operator to provide me like a sandbox to operate in, and focusing my pod more on the business logic of my app. And so I don't know, that also just felt like a recurring tension, because a lot of the same users I feel like I'd been spending a lot of time talking to were the types of users who would balk at that pattern and instead want like lockdown nodes with log forwarding or all those other use cases that were called out for sidecars that could have been skewing my thinking, and my thinking is not necessarily always the right thinking, but it felt like service mesh was the only major one I felt was ringing through. So anyway, I'm curious if others see that tension, but I feel like it's there all the time.
It may be you're talking with bigger corporations when there is a dedicated IT support team that can do all those infrastructure changes for the development team. Like if you're talking with smaller companies, you probably will see more of a pattern when developers want to have more control over what they inject, like what versions they use and stuff like that. So
yeah, I can see it for both. I just and so that's why I recognize maybe who I was talking to is the issue, but it did feel like a lot of us all talk to big users. And so those same users you need to keep happy with the project and not provide workarounds that they're trying to lock down. And so I was largely looking to see if there were use cases outside of service mesh that were not oriented around things like log forwarding, where there wasn't necessarily another path forward that many users could provide or look at. So anyway, that said, did merge the CAP and we continue to work through it, but it is a complicated topic.
Derek, just like what Sergey said, and we talked to the Istio cases, and I believe not just depend as even we enable the CNI approach, and they still require the today's Statica container, and also actually they hope we can even expand it today's the Statica container approach, and there's some other use cases is not handled, but I agree with you. From the type,
it's like if you talk to Tim Hawking, your colleague, right? He'd say, "I can't give a controller arbitrary exec privileges in my pod. I just won't do it." And then I know he's probably talking to the same security style conscious users I would talk to. But then why those same users would allow dynamic injection of containers in their pod is crazy to me. It's the same problem. It's like, let's let a random high privilege thing change the operating functional space of my pod, but then not let you exec in to see what it was doing. Like, I'm trying to get over that dichotomy because we seem to look at it from two perspectives.
Yeah,
so.
And also I want to add one thing, just like the response for the what Sergey just mentioned. So we need to figure out who is our customer, who is the user, and I believe what Derek described is represent like at least it is the top use cases here. And then second use case is obviously like for the developer. And I think there's the other way to solve those problems. And also sometimes for like the arbitrary, they want to change, have the whole control for developer for their entire of the working environment. I have a question. Maybe Kubernetes or fully support the functional Kubernetes. Is that the right approach? And so I have the question. I think this kind of question we raised a long time ago when we first started Kubernetes. And because I think about the Kubernetes is try to help like because for those developer, if the test scenario, they could totally control their environment, test the node. But if they make that is the production use cases, they want to deploy the application, then they definitely require about the cluster admin and to create off the workable nodes, a group of the workable cluster and nodes for them, so they don't need to have the full control about those nodes, have the root access to the nodes. So that's kind of production use cases. I think we should separate that. Otherwise, we cannot move forward. This is also kind of the responsible I will give to response to the team hacking and my colleague. So this is kind of separate cases, right? So for as I'm the developer, if I want to develop an application, I containerize, and there have the container runtime. There's a single node, maybe to do those for the quick test dive, quick test. But once before I want staging and roll out Caloria, that's the different cases. So it needs to separate those things. Otherwise, we cannot make progress here.
Yeah. Either way, I'll follow up on what we're doing on the Red Hat side a little closer. But I still just felt like dynamic injecting containers in one KEP and then looking at another KEP saying arbitrary execs are bad felt like me being hypocritical in my own mind. So anyway, thanks for the follow-up for you guys on the Google side for what you saw there, and I'll take a look at what we're doing.
Do you think it's better for us to talk to each other, like the directly, like the both service mesh cases, and also you and me and a couple people interested on this topic, and we can have the dedicated meeting, just meet this topic, and we can sort out. That would be that will be helpful, make quicker decision and move forward.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. I'll try to get that. All right. I got to
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thanks.